Chapter 3. When the men were throwing away their ration cans and lighting up cigarettes, not long after Prentice had managed to swallow his tears, it began to snow. Big, soft flakes came down at first from the darkening sky. Then they thinned out into tiny points of white that whirled in the wind until the snow was flying rather than falling, making it hard to see anything except at close range, making it necessary to squint and blink to see anything at all. Out of this white confusion, a train of empty boxcars drew up to a stop on the tracks beside them. And soon, from far away across the field, came one and then another of the long line of open trucks, each packed with standing men. The first battalion, after its month in combat, was coming back off the line. There was an uneasy stirring among the replacements, most of whom got to their feet as the trucks came closer. What would they be like, these veterans? How would they feel about meeting men and boys fresh from the States with the chalked numerals of Camp Shanks still plain on their helmets? Would they be friendly? Or would they laugh and point and shout obscenities? Prentice began trying to make out individual faces in the first truck when it was still many yards away, but all he could see were their dull helmets, which were covered with combat netting. Then the trucks had drawn up and stopped, parallel to the tracks, and the men were shockingly visible as they dropped off over the tailgates and milled around in little groups of their own. Most of them had beards. Some wore grimy woolen hoods under their helmets, and others had used towels or pieces of blanket for the same purpose. Most of their overcoats were burned at the hem and hanging in blackened shreds, probably from standing too close to campfires, and none of them had combat boots. Some wore old-style canvas leggings, stiff and shrunken. Some had improvised their own leg wrappings with torn strips of cloth, and others let their pants hang indifferently in or outside the loose tops of their galoshes. Their faces were all brownish-gray with black lips that slackened occasionally to disclose surprisingly pink interiors. And these inner lips were the only clean parts of each man's face, except for the bright blank eyes. If they felt anything at all on seeing the replacements, they gave no sign. 8 company replacements over here, the headquarters sergeant called, holding his clipboard aloft in the whirling flakes. Beside him stood a ragged man who looked no different from the other veterans, and whose eyes seemed to be counting the replacements as they gathered around. "Shit," he said, "is this all I get?" The sergeant mumbled something apologetic, and when he backed away, it was odd to hear him call the ragged man "sir." "All right," the ragged man said, raising his voice to address the group. "My name's Lieutenant Agate, and you won't have any trouble remembering that because I'm the only officer left in this company." It was a high, rasping voice, and as he talked, he kept taking a few steps forward and a few back, like a man in a cage. "We're going to get on this train now, and it's no use anybody asking me where we're going because I don't know. We're going south, I know that much, and we'll be going up to the line again very shortly. I'll try to get around and talk to you on the train, get you oriented a little bit. Meantime, I'll give you some advice. I'll advise you to keep your eyes and ears open and your mouth shut around my men. They're all sore as hell, and so am I. We were supposed to be going back for a rest this morning, and now they've sprung this new shit on us. All right, that's all I gotta say." In the boxcar, which had no straw on its splintered floor, the replacements huddled together to give the veterans most of the room. Prentice sat cold and hungry in a corner as far away as possible from Quint, and he spent the afternoon watching the veterans and trying to figure them out. It was apparently the first time any of them had seen their duffel bags since before going into combat. The bags were all either soaked or frozen from having lain for a month in some supply dump, and most of the veterans who stayed awake were clawing through their moldy possessions like haggard rag pickers. The most conspicuous was a skinny, awkward man with the face of a clown and a voice that rose to falsetto shrieks of laughter. Probing in his bag, which bore the faded stenciling of the name Mays, he had pulled out a clean overseas cap and set it rakishly on his tangled head. Then he found his wrinkled brass-buttoned tunic and pulled it on over his filthy field jacket. "Hey, you guys ready to go on pass?" he kept shouting, delighted with the comic effect of his costume. "You guys want to go down and get laid tonight? Look at me, I'm all ready. Let's go." And no matter how many times he said the same thing, it drove him into uncontrollable giggles. "Let's go. Hey, let's go get laid tonight. Everybody ready? Let's go to town. Look at me, I'm all set to go." But however annoyingly shrill he grew, it was clear that he commanded respect. The other veterans either ignored him or smiled at his antics. Nobody told him to shut up. He was evidently a non-com of some kind, possibly a squad leader, though there was no chevrons on his old tunic. In any case, he was someone who had proved himself and could therefore play the fool as much as he liked. At the other extreme was a square-jawed man who seemed to want nothing more than a chance to sleep, and who incurred the merciless scorn of everyone around him. "Hilton, move your useless ass. Damn it, Hilton, get your feet off my stuff. What the hell does Hilton need sleep for? Ain't he been sleeping his life away all month?" Hilton would only blink and obey his tormentors with a mild, drugged smile of chronic humiliation. And Prentice watched him with a terrible sense of foreboding. It was possible, then, to be one of the handful of combat survivors and still be despised. Soon after dark, the train came to a stop and a pair of hands slid a carton of sea rations into the car. It would be the first time Prentice had eaten all day, but he knew he would have to wait until one of the veterans opened the box and distributed the cans, and none of them seemed hungry. Most of them dropped out into the snow at the cry of "piss call" to take advantage of the stop. It was during this same stop that Lieutenant Agade climbed into the car with a flashlight, followed by a big, stout man who was evidently the first sergeant. "All right, all you new men," Agade said, "I want you to get your names and find out something about your background. First man over here, what's your name?" And the flashlight beam fell on the squinting face of Sam Rand, who identified himself. "How much infantry training you had, Rand?" 6 weeks, sir, is all. Before that, I had 3 years in the engineers." "Okay, next man." And he went through the replacements that way until the light came full into Prentice's face, making him wince and feel the stares of everyone in the car. "Prentice, sir, 6 weeks infantry training. Before that, I had 6 weeks in the Air Force." "Where were you before that?" "Nowhere, sir." And as the laughter rose and broke around him, he said, I was a civilian before that." "Son of a bitch," said Lieutenant Agate, and the flashlight went away. He conferred quietly with his first sergeant for a while, and then the flashlight swept the replacement's end of the car again. "Weapons platoon needs a man or two. Any of you men familiar with the light machine gun?" "I am, sir." "Who's that again?" "Quint, sir." "Okay, Quint, you report to Sergeant Rolls soon as we get off the train. Tell him you're assigned to his section. Got that? ROLLs. Another man was singled out to serve with a mortar section. The rest of them were to be riflemen. Then, as an afterthought, Agate said, "Oh, hey, wait a second. Second platoon needs a runner. Anybody?" The flashlight came into Prentice's eyes again. "Do you want the runner's job?" "All right, sir." And he was told to report to a Sergeant Brewer. He wasn't wholly sure what a runner's job was, but he suspected it was something easier and safer than being a rifleman. He suspected, too, that Agate had picked him because he was the youngest, or maybe because he looked the least competent. Still, it had a nice individual sound to it, the runner. And apparently there was only one for each platoon. Didn't that mean it might carry a certain amount of responsibility? "All right, here's the story," Agate said, raising his voice to include everyone in the car. "We're going into the 7th Army sector, down in Alsace. Looks like we're turning into one of these bastard divisions they shove all over the map to plug up holes. Anyway, we'll be under the command of the French 1st Army, whatever the hell that means, and we'll be going up to the line tomorrow sometime. We'll be relieving the 3rd Division. That's all I know for now. There's going to be trucks waiting for us when we get off the train. Meantime, you better get as much sleep as you can." Prentice was lucky enough to find Sergeant Brewer soon after the train had stopped. And he was lucky, too, in that Sergeant Brewer turned out to be a big, kindly Westerner with pleasant manners. "You're the new runner, right?" he asked, standing in the snow with his gloved hand and folding Prentice's in a painfully reassuring clinch. "What's your name again?" "Okay, Prentice, I'll fix it for you to meet the squad leaders and everything later on, as soon as we're settled." And Prentice had to fight an impulse to cling to Sergeant Brewer, whimpering for protection. "Right now, though, you better hurry along and get into that truck." The slow ride in the truck convoy, whining in first and second gear over endless mountain roads, somebody said they were in the Vosges, was unbelievably cold. After a while, Prentice could feel nothing of his legs from the knees down. It was useless to try flexing his toes or stamping his feet. It could have been 2 hours or 5 hours or 8 that they traveled. He had lost all sense of time in the cold that held him sitting as stiff as a corpse. When they stopped at last, it was almost impossible for him to stand and move. He dropped off and fell in the snow, and it was several seconds before he could get up. They were quartered for the rest of the night in a big shelled-out factory deep between the slopes of two great hills. It was better than sleeping outdoors, but not much, for all the factory's windows and ragged sections of its walls were open to the wind. Working in the glow of matches and candle stubs, they made their beds on long, waist-high work tables that were cluttered with metal scraps and bits of broken glass. It was still dark when Prentice woke up in a convulsion of coughing, hearing a loud, tearful voice across the room that sounded remarkably like his own. "Oh, Jesus, help me, somebody. I'm sick. I can't breathe. Oh, Jesus, please, medic, somebody help me. I'm sick." His coughing had forced him upright on the work table. He began to retch and leaned over to drop clots of phlegm on the floor. Then, all at once, still retching, he felt hands gripping his arms and a flashlight was blazing in his face. And he dimly saw that one of the men holding him wore the white encircled red cross of the medics on his helmet. "What's the matter, kid? You're the one that called out?" "No, somebody else over there." "Oh, Jesus, somebody please help me." The flashlight in the hands went away, and in a minute he saw the medics helping a tall, stumbling, weeping figure down one of the aisles between the work tables and away into the darkness. In the morning, they were issued ammunition in what seemed unnecessary amounts, enough rifle clips to fill the cartridge belt, many additional clips in 3 cotton bandoliers that hung crisscross from the shoulders, and 2 hand grenades apiece. For half an hour or so, they lingered in the factory to work over their gear, each man separating the things to be left behind, in duffel bags and bedrolls, from the things to be carried into the field. Prentice worked not with the 2nd platoon, but with the much smaller company headquarters group, which was composed of the other platoon runners, the bazooka man, a couple of communications men, and several other specialists whose jobs he didn't understand. The only one who talked to him was a very short boy named Owens. He looked too small to have been taken into the army, who was the runner for the weapons platoon. "Take plenty of cigarettes," Owens counseled him, "and take all the socks you've got, even if it seems like too many. You don't change your socks often enough, you wind up with trench foot. And take toothpaste, too, if you've got any. I know that seems funny, but toothpaste comes in handy as hell. Sometimes you brush your teeth, it's almost as good as getting a night's sleep." The only toothpaste Prentice could find in his bag was a big economy-sized tube of Ipana that he must have acquired in the PX at Camp Pickett. And whether it seemed funny or not, he stuffed it into one of his shirt pockets along with his toothbrush. When they moved out, it was to march 5 miles to something called the Forward Assembly Area. At first, the march seemed easy, with so little to carry, and the action of walking helped to keep the cold out. But before long, Prentice's knees had gone soft, and he felt feverish. The loaded cartridge belt was a heavy drag at his waist, and the bandolier straps were cutting into his neck. "Mutt and Jeff," Lieutenant Agate was calling, walking backwards at the head of the column, and Prentice saw with a start that he was smiling straight at him. "Guys, look like Mutt and Jeff," he called again, and this time Prentice got the point. That he and Owens, who was walking beside him, made a comic contrast of tall and short. "How's the cough, kid?" the lieutenant called. And when Prentice tried to say, "Okay, sir," he found he had lost his voice. He tried again, and nothing but a whisper came out. Finally, he shaped his cracked lips into a smile and nodded, hoping that would take care of it. And as soon as he tried to clear, and he's, Jesus, and as he walked, he tried to clear his throat. "Hey, Owens," he tried to say, "listen, I've lost my voice." And he managed enough of a squeak to make Owens look up. "What?" "I've lost my voice. I can't talk." "Laryngitis, I guess." Owens had his own problems. He said this morning that he thought he had dysentery, and he didn't seem to be feeling any better. "All right," the lieutenant was calling now. "Spread it out, 5 paces apart." The forward assembly area, somewhere up past the artillery positions, was a thinly wooded field of snow in which they were told to dig 2-man foxholes. The digging quickly exhausted Prentice. His quivering jabs with the entrenching tool became less and less effectual. But Owens helped him out, and before long they had a hole deep enough to be considered finished. For what seemed hundreds of yards in all directions, the field was ravaged by black holes and mounds of thrown-up earth. Everywhere men crouched and dug, or sat in their holes and waited, or gathered in nervous little groups to talk about what they were heading for, which was said to be something called the Colmar Pocket. 1st Battalion was to lead the attack, and their first objective was to be the taking of a town called Orborg, around which elements of the 3rd Division were said to have been embattled for several days. It all sounded unreal to Prentice. "How long?" he squeaked to Owens. "How long do you think we'll be staying here?" "Oh, probably till morning. I don't think they'd have us digging in if they figured on moving us out any sooner." But he was wrong. They moved out that same afternoon. A shelled-out village some 3 miles to the rear of Orborg was the jumping-off point for the attack. 8 company arrived there to find the place a jumble of men and machines. The broken streets, strung with many-colored communications wire, were crawling with vehicles of all kinds. And there were men from the 57th, the 3rd, and a French unit, all busy and hurrying in what seemed a state of total confusion. There were a few civilians, too, mostly old men and women in black with shy, bewildered faces. It puzzled Prentice at first that they seemed to be speaking German, and that the spattered road signs were in German too, until a dim store of schoolroom knowledge reminded him that Alsace was only technically a part of France. You hear what I heard?" Owens asked him as the column sat resting against a shrapnel-scarred wall, waiting for a gate to finish his briefing with a number of other officers. "They say Orborg's changed hands 3 times in the past 2 days." "Changed what?" "Changed hands between us and the Germans." "Oh no, I hadn't heard that." His voice was still either a squeak or a husk, and he was weak and lightheaded from the day of marching and digging and marching again. He hoped a Gates briefing would take a long time, so that he could stay seated on this wet sidewalk with his back against the wall. He wasn't sure if he'd be able to get up and move again. The orders, according to a Gate, were that they would move out soon after nightfall. An artillery barrage would be laid down on Orborg at 7 o'clock, and then they'd go in. In the meantime, each platoon was assigned to a separate cellar or stable in the village for resting and waiting. The password for the night was Mickey Mouse. Prentice was called upon to deliver several routine messages to Sergeant Brewer while they waited. And he found his fever and fatigue dissolving into a kind of appalled exhilaration that felt nothing at all like fear. He hoped he was being noticed as he walked slowly but conspicuously alone down the streets of churned snow, where everyone else was moving in groups, and he took pride in delivering his small messages, even though the effort of speaking made him twist and rise on tiptoe before any sound came out. He hoped the men who overheard him wouldn't think his chirping was his normal voice. Late in the afternoon, the company cooks brought food up to the village for the first hot meal they'd had since Belgium. Salmon patties, dehydrated potatoes, and canned fruit salad. And most of the men seemed in high spirits as they sat or squatted over their mess kits in the street. What kind of cat shit is this? Salmon patty cat shit, that's what kind. Prentice looked around for Quint but couldn't see him, though he did catch a glimpse of Sam Rand soberly chewing and talking with some other men. It occurred to him that Sam Rand was the only man in sight he really knew, and that of all the others he knew only 3 or 4 by name. Even so, he began to feel a sentimental affection for all of them. Very soon now, all these strangers might as well be his friends. But he found he could only eat a few mouthfuls without retching, and after he'd thrown away most of his meal, he felt the sickness closing in on him again. He found a broken slab of concrete to sit down on and wondered if he dared to light a cigarette. The worst thing about Orborg now was that it was 3 miles away. He felt it would take everything he had to walk 3 miles. The scene around him began to float and blur, and if there had been a place to lay his head, he would have fallen instantly asleep. "Move over, old buddy," said John Quint's voice. And there he came, lugging a machine gun barrel on his shoulder, slowly strutting out of the crowd with his cold pipe clenched upside down in his teeth. He had apparently forgotten that he and Prentice were not on speaking terms. "You look like I feel," he said, letting himself carefully down on the slab. "It's funny, you know, I felt, what the Christ's the matter with your voice? I don't know, laryngitis or something. But I mean, it's funny, you know. I felt pretty good just before we ate, and now I'm sick as hell again. I guess it comes and goes." "That's what's the matter, all right. Same with me, and it's going to come a whole hell of a lot worse before it goes." It was comforting to have Quint there. It seemed to help things come back into focus. Some men nearby were pointing upward, and Prentice looked up to discover that the rich blue of the sky was intricately marked with white vapor trails. Aerial combat was taking place between fighter planes too high to see except as dots at the head of each trail, like the planes that used to spell out Pepsi-Cola high over New York on summer afternoons. But the act of looking up doubled Prentice over in a seizure of coughing that twisted him with pain and left his head hanging between his knees. "Prentice, look," Quint said. And at first Prentice thought he meant look up at the planes, but that wasn't what he meant. "Look, let's quit kidding ourselves. You know what I think? I think we both got pneumonia. Either that or we're pretty far along in the process of getting it. We've got all the damn symptoms." "Well, but how about all these other guys? How come they don't have it? Guys that have been sleeping in the snow for a month in the bulge." "Oh, balls, Prentice, it's got nothing to do with that. People get pneumonia in April and May. Babies get it. Athletes in top condition get it. Old ladies get it walking around the dime store. It's a disease, that's all. And when you get a disease, you're supposed to go to the hospital." Prentice thought it over. "You mean you want to go back?" "I mean, I think we both ought to go get a gate and tell them we're sick. Tell them we can't make it and go back to the aid station. Right now. Doesn't that sound sensible?" And the remarkable thing was that Quint's face, owlish and bespectacled, heavily fringed with beard, had an exasperation that Prentice had never seen on it before. A look of defiance clearly mixed with pleading. For the first time in all these months, Quint was asking Prentice for guidance instead of the other way around. It was an oddly dramatic moment, exactly like a moment in the movies when the music stops dead on the soundtrack while the hero makes up his mind. And it didn't take Prentice long to decide what his answer would be. It didn't even matter that it had to come out in his absurd falsetto. "No," he said, "I don't want to." Quint put his pipe back in his mouth and looked down at his overshoes. "I mean, don't let me stop you, Quint, if that's what you want to do. You go ahead. I'm staying, that's all." He knew he was laying himself open to a charge of false heroics, but he didn't care. And whether Quint saw the opening or not, he didn't take advantage of it. "Okay," he said. "I mean, after this Orborg business is over, maybe I'll go back, but not before. It's just a thing I'd never feel right about doing, that's all." "Okay," Quint said, "you made your point." And that was the end of their talk. though the weight of it hung like something palpable between them as they blinked at each other and then avoided each other's eyes. A Company led off in the battalion column that night. 3rd Platoon went first, then came the command group or headquarters platoon. Then came the 1st and then the 2nd, with weapons platoon bringing up the rear. They walked in strict silence most of the way to Orborg, 5 paces apart on either side of the road, each man with his eyes fixed on the back of the man ahead. Then they waited, crouched in the dark roadside ditches for their artillery support. When it came, in great fluttering rushes overhead that ended in earth-rocking explosions lighting up the sky, it seemed to go on forever. And when it was over, it seemed that nothing could be left alive in Orborg. Trembling in the ditch, Prentice forced all his attention on the dim shape of Owen's back. When it rose and wavered silently upward, he scrambled after it, up to the surface of the road again, hearing a muffled rustle and clink of equipment, as the man behind him did the same. He was very conscious of the sound of his own breathing as he walked, a rapid, shallow rasp in and out of his nose in counterpoint to the faint, steady hum of the wind through his helmet. He wished he could be close enough to the other men to see if they were still carrying their rifles on the sling, as he was, or if they'd taken them in their hands for greater readiness. He had just about decided to unsling his rifle when Owen's back floated up close enough to reveal the vertical line of the sling rifle beside his helmet, black against the snow, so he kept his own rifle where it was. Almost before he realized it, the ghost-white fields on either side of the road gave way to the dark shapes of houses. They must be in Horborg by now, or at least on its outskirts. And without worrying about Owens, he slid the sling off his shoulder and carried his rifle at port arms with his gloved finger trembling on the safety, and slipping experimentally in and out of the trigger guard. And he thought it might look silly if he were the only man in the column doing that, so he put it back on the sling. But then Owen's back came up close enough to show that he was walking at port arms now, and off it came again. Gradually and then suddenly, the road ahead was illuminated with a wavering orange glow. It was a house on fire, one of the houses on the other side of the road. As they moved past it, the individual shapes and shadows of the men were clearly visible. For several seconds, Prentice could even see the dirty brown nap of Owens's overcoat and the dirty green squares of netting on his helmet. And a thought occurred to him that was instantly put into words by the man behind him. Jesus, we're perfect targets. But except for the hiss and crackle of timbers and flames that night, the night remained dead silent until they were well past the burning house, enclosed once more in the protection of darkness. Prentice resumed the difficult job of watching Owens's helmet until it suddenly came up very close, and he realized Owens had stopped. He stopped too and moved back a few steps. Apparently the whole column had come to a halt. Glancing down and to the left, he saw the unmistakable shape of a man lying in the snow. It struck him as odd for a second. What the hell was he lying down for? Until he realized the man was dead. It was impossible to tell whether he was German or French or American. He looked back at Owens's helmet just in time to see it turn and disclose the pale oval of his face. Owens was whispering something to him, and at first he thought it must be some comment on the dead man, but it wasn't. "What's that?" he whispered back. "Send up the first platoon. Pass it on." And Prentice turned around to face the dark blur of the stranger behind him. "Send up the first platoon," he whispered. Pass it on." Soon from the rear, there came a scuffle of overshoes and a muted creak and jingle of equipment as the men of the first platoon moved up to receive their orders. Did everyone have better night vision than Prentice? It was all he could do to concentrate on the floating shape of Owens's helmet, waiting to see if it would turn again. It turned. "Send up the second platoon. Pass it on." He was pleased that he'd heard it right the first time. He turned back and repeated the words, and in a little while the second platoon came plodding up past him in the darkness. Then he waited, studying the helmet for what seemed a very long time. The next order came as a stunning surprise. Send Prentice up. He went dog-trotting past Owens with his heart in his mouth, past a number of other shadowy figures, and on up to Lieutenant Agate, whose anger was visible even in the dark. Damn it, boy, where have you been? When I say second platoon, that means you. I know, sir. I'm sorry. All right, Logan, take him up and show him where the hell they are, and hurry up. Logan was the communications sergeant, tall and sardonic. Christ, he whispered, are you going to start fucking up already? Can't you stay on the ball? You're the second platoon runner. Can't you get that straight in your head? Now you're holding up the whole fucking works. I know, I just didn't think. Well, you better start thinking, kiddo. This is important. He knew it was important, and he stumbled along as fast as he could beside Logan, weak with embarrassment. There, Logan said. See that house? That's where your platoon is. Now, for Christ's sake, don't fucking forget it. And Prentice stared at the dim face of the house for all he was worth. The way he committed it to memory was that its roof, instead of sloping, was built in steps. Okay, he whispered, and went loping after Logan, afraid he might lose him as they ran back to the column. He was able to recognize Owens because of his shortness and fell into place behind him again. But the brief run had winded him, and he began to cough wretchedly. Trying his best to stifle it, he heard someone say, "Shut that bastard up!" But he had to cough again and again, doubled over with his fist in his mouth. The spasms held him blind and crouching for a long time, until time itself seemed to have stopped. And when he straightened up at last and opened his eyes to the whirling darkness, Owens was gone. He took several faltering steps forward, but Owens wasn't there, and neither was anyone else. There was nothing ahead but snow and blackness. He spun around and looked behind him. Nobody. Nothing but empty road, and far in the distance the glowing of the burning house. He was alone. He ran forward, the straps biting his neck and the 2 grenades bouncing heavily on his ribs. He had no idea where he was going, but there seemed to be nothing to do but run. Once he tripped and nearly went sprawling over something that felt like a soft log and proved, when he looked back, to be another corpse. And finally he made out some movement ahead across the road, and he ran in that direction. It was a trotting column of 4 or 5 men. Good God, were they Germans? No, Americans. And he ran up to the first of them, gasping for breath. Is this the headquarters platoon? The man didn't answer or even slow down. I said, is this the headquarters platoon? And at that instant, the air was split by a high whistling shriek and a tremendous slam, with a burst of yellow in the road. All the men hit the road on their bellies at once, and Prentice fell with them. Another shriek, another slam, and they all scurried to fall again behind the shelter of a big nameless shape several yards away. It seemed to be a truck lying on its side. Mortars, somebody said, but that was all Prentice could hear except the repeated shriek, slam, and the whir and ping of flying fragments. Then from somewhere not far away came a shy, tremulous voice that rose to a frantic, childish cry of shock and pain. Medic? Medic? Oh, Jesus, medic! Oh, Jesus, medic, medic! 5 or 6 more mortar shells hit the road while Prentice and the others lay behind the fallen truck, which had turned out not to be a truck at all, but an armored half-track. And finally, there was an abrupt, ringing silence. One by one, the shadowy men rose into a crouch and ran, and Prentice went up to the first man. Where's headquarters platoon? But the man moved past him without a word. Look, excuse me, where's headquarters platoon? But the next man ran past him too, and the next, and then there was only one left. For Christ's sake, tell me, where's headquarters platoon? His terrible voice broke into a womanish wail on the tune, and he knew it sounded as if he were crying. But at least it was enough to make the man turn around, and he was close enough to be recognized. It was Maze, the clown from the boxcar. Prentice tried to atone for his tearful-sounding voice by staggering a little more than necessary to prove he was really sick. "What do you want? A gate?" Maze said. "Come on, then." Prentice followed him, deeply ashamed both of the tune and the fraudulent stagger. The men led him back some 50 yards down the road, turned in between two houses so abruptly that he almost lost them, and went clambering down a flight of pitch-black cellar stairs. A door opened onto a blanket hung as a blackout curtain, and beyond the blanket, inside the cellar, a gate and all the other headquarters men were huddled in the weak yellow light of a single candle. Prentice looked quickly around at Maze and his squad to see if they were laughing at him or looking at him with contempt, but they paid him no attention at all. Maze was talking rapidly now with the gate, while the others stood by. Then a gate nodded and gave some curt instructions, and they went out again as quickly as they'd come. The cellar contained a great deal of mildewed furniture, and several of the men were sitting in chairs. That meant it was all right to sit down. He found a deep, upholstered armchair and sank into it as if into a morass of self-abasement, staring tragically into the candlelight. He had fucked up badly, twice. If anyone wanted to give him the uprating he deserved, now was the time. He would sit here and take it, however it came. But nobody looked at him, and after a while it began to seem that they weren't ignoring him out of disgust. They simply hadn't noticed he was there, and possibly they hadn't noticed he'd been missing in the first place. He glanced furtively at Logan, ready to accept any kind of derision from him. But Logan was wholly absorbed in his hand radio, speaking in tense monotone, repeating words that Prentice was now dimly aware of having heard ever since his arrival in the cellar. "Donkey Nan," he was saying. "Donkey Nan, this is Donkey Dog. Donkey Dog. Do you read me? Over." Then he paused, listening, and started again. "Donkey Nan, Donkey Nan." A soft moan came from the shadows along the far wall, and Prentice made out the figure of a medic crouched over an inert form on the floor. It must have been the wounded man, the man who'd cried out on the road. "This is Donkey Dog. Donkey Dog, do you read me? Over." And Logan turned to the lieutenant. "Can't seem to get him, sir." "Shit. Okay, get the runner. Where's that, what's his name? The kid?" And Prentice bolted clumsily to his feet. "Go on over to your platoon," Agate told him. "Find out why they're not answering. If their radio's broken or anything, bring Brewer back to me. Got that?" "Yes, sir." "You know where they are now?" "Yes, sir," he said, though all he could remember was a house with a stepped roof. He had no idea where it was. As he hurried across the cellar floor, the house was jarred by a great slam, and then another and another. "That's artillery this time," someone was saying. "That's 88s. "No, it's both," somebody else said. "That it's mortars and 88s. Prentice paused near the door and looked back at a gate. Was he supposed to go anyway, in the middle of all this? Or was he supposed to wait until the barrage was over? But Agate had turned away and was talking to someone else. Go anyway. At least it was better than going back to ask. A grizzled, old-looking man named Luchek was standing wide-eyed with his back to the wall, beside the blackout curtain. "Jesus, kid," he said, "you going out now?" "Guess I've got to," Prentice said, beginning to feel very much like the hero of a war movie. And he stood with his hand on the blanket, waiting for the pause in the shelling. He looked back once again at Agate, but Agate was still turned away. Then he slipped out around the curtain and ran up the steps. There was nothing but silence as he ran down the path to the road. And not until he'd almost gained the road did he fully realize in a panic that he didn't know which way to turn, right or left. He decided desperately on left, but how far away was the house with the stepped roof? And how would he know how far to go before giving it up and trying the other direction? He had just made the turn to the road, heading left, when a rapid fluttering rush of air sent him sprawling heavily on his chest. And slam. It was louder than the mortar shells. This must be artillery. Then came another fluttering rush and another slam, and a number of small objects, hard but not heavy, fell across his buttocks and thighs. They couldn't be shell fragments, they were chunks of broken roof or wall. He was up and running again, looking urgently at the dark passing face of each house. Shriek, slam! Shriek, slam! Those were mortar shells. He was numbly proud of being able to tell the difference now, and they were clearly so far away that he didn't even bother to hit the ground. But then came the rush of an 88, so shockingly brief that its huge explosion caught him still on his feet. He felt the jolt and saw the flash of it as he fell headlong on his grenades, and he heard the fragments zip and whine away very close to him. He was still lying there, uncertain whether to wait or get up and run again, when he lifted his helmet away from his eyes and saw the house with the stepped roof, no more than 10 or 15 yards away. He got up and ran. "Who's that? Is that Prentice?" said Sergeant Brewer's voice from a dark cluster of men standing just inside the door. "Yes." And Prentice went stumbling in among them. Only later did he realize that they probably should have said Mickey and Mouse. "The lieutenant," he said, and started coughing. "The lieutenant wants to know why you're not answering the the radio. He says if it's broken." But it wasn't broken. Brewer's radio man was crouched and fussing with the dials, and before Prentice could finish his sentence, he had made contact. "Donkey Dog," he was saying. "Donkey Dog, this is Donkey Nan, Donkey Nan. I'm reading you loud and clear. Over." Brewer took the radio and started talking into it, probably to a gate. Prentice couldn't follow the words and wouldn't have been very interested if he could. He leaned panting against the wall and gave in to a sense of triumph. He had made it. The jogging run back to the headquarters cellar was very short and uneventful. Only a few mortar shells came in far down the road, probably at the place where the ruined half-track lay. He hadn't exactly expected anyone to shake his hand and say, "Nice work, Prentice," when he got back to the cellar, but still, it was faintly disappointed that nobody did, and that nobody even seemed to notice he was back as he dragged himself over to his easy chair and sat down again. Then suddenly both Agate and Logan were looking at him with stern faces. "How far away are they, kid?" Agate said, and Prentice felt his chest go tight as if he were a suspect on a witness stand. "About 100 yards, sir, to the left." 100 yards? 100 feet, 30 yards, something like that, maybe 50. They both turned away again, and only after several minutes did he realize that they hadn't been grilling him. They hadn't been trying to find out if he'd really made the trip or faked it, or to see if he would exaggerate the distance. They wanted to know how far away it was, for reasons of their own. And this was such a great relief that he felt free to relax for the first time all day. He even felt free to take off his helmet and tenderly finger his scalp, where the roots of his matted hair were sore from wearing the helmet so long. The odd coughing noise of American mortars began from somewhere near the cellar. The mortar section of a weapons platoon had opened up to return the enemy's shelling. As he listened, it occurred to him that this was the first time anyone in A Company had fired a shot. He hadn't yet heard any machine guns or rifles. Could this be all that was meant by an attack? A duel of mortars and artillery while you sat in an upholstered chair by candlelight? Gradually, sitting there, he became aware of an oddly familiar civilian smell in his nostrils. A yellow minty smell, and of a wet glutinous mass that had fastened to the left side of his shirt to his chest, under one of the grenades and deep inside the layers of winter clothing. It was the economy-sized tube of Ipana crushed and ruptured from his falls on the road. There wasn't much sleep to be had in the cellar that night, and Prentice got almost none. He had to stand his share of guard duty outside the cellar door, more than his share once when Owens came moaning about having dysentery and having to lie down. And when he wasn't on guard, he lay awake on the floor, coughing and sweating in fever, listening to the intermittent sounds of shelling. Once, during a lull in the noise, Logan roused him to take the lieutenant over to the platoon for a conference with Brewer. Another time, after an incendiary shell had crashed through the roof of the house, he had to join in this general staggering upstairs and help put out the fire. Just before dawn, he dozed off long enough to have some kind of grotesque, instantly forgotten dream. And the first thing that hit him when he woke up was the smell of found 3 fresh eggs, which he was solemnly cooking for himself, and a bottle of wine from which he took long, relishing swigs as the eggs smoked and spattered in the pan. He had taken off his helmet and all his equipment. He looked cozy and self-indulgent and not at all like a company commander as he went about his breakfast. Donkey Obo, Logan was saying into his radio, and then Donkey Nan, and Donkey Key, and Donkey Easy. He was calling all the platoons and telling them that they'd be moving out at 0600, and that, according to Prentice's watch, was 5 minutes from now. The lieutenant stood up, wiped a trickle of egg yolk from his chin, and lobbed the wine bottle crashing into a corner. Then he put his helmet on over his dirty hair, buckled himself into his gear, and said, "Okay, let's get going. No overcoats, leave 'em here, and we'll send back for 'em later." Prentice hated to leave his overcoat. He knew the idea of not wearing it was to assure greater maneuverability in action, but this seemed hardly to apply in his case. He felt unable to maneuver at all, overcoat or not. When they moved cautiously out of the cellar, he in his shaking hands and the equipment sagging from his shoulders and waist seemed an intolerable weight. Was it possible that he'd run and fallen and gotten up and run again only last night? The early morning light revealed several new and surprising things about the road, or street. That all its houses were maimed, with shattered windows and ragged walls, and that a cluster of 3 dead Germans lay in shocking stillness directly in front of the headquarters house. They had apparently been dead for days. Their hands and faces seemed to be made of putty, and their eyes were like dusty marbles. A little farther on, 2 or 3 houses away, they came upon a dead American. He was face down at the roadside, partly covered with snow thrown up by passing vehicles. But enough of him was exposed to show that he had curly brown hair and a snub-nosed, full-lipped profile. His skin was the same color as the Germans', skin that looked incapable of ever having been alive. But it was his uniform that affected Prentice most. How could anyone be dead who wore these terribly familiar clothes and straps, with this terribly familiar canteen against his right buttock? There was an intermittent crack and a stutter of small arms fire now in another part of town, probably another company's sector, and the gate and the other headquarters men were moving with a stealthiness that showed they expected a burst of fire at any moment. They hugged each wall and hurried, one at a time, across the open spaces between each house. Second platoon was following close behind them with equal slowness and care. As they approached the ruined half-track, Prentice saw that its markings were French, and that the body of a very small French soldier wearing a GI field jacket lay primly on his back 6 feet away, apparently blown from the wreckage. When they came to the corner of an intersection, a gate stopped, motioning for his men to stop too and stay close to the wall. Then he beckoned for the second platoon to come forward. Evidently, the platoon would brave it into the new street while the command group held back. Sergeant Brewer held back too, crouched against the wall with the gate, with his rifle squads moved on around the corner. Only after the last of the squads was out of sight, a group that included the portly figure of Sam Rand, only then did he go after them, followed by his radio man and his platoon medic, and this troubled Prentice a little. Weren't platoon leaders supposed to lead? But then company commanders were supposed to lead too, and so were battalion commanders, and so were generals. It was too confusing to think about. He lowered his rifle and allowed the butt to rest on the ground, which brought a small relief to the muscles of his right arm. And he looked down at the trampled snow with longing, wishing he could let his knees go slack, slide forward against the wall, and lie down on it. From around the corner came a stunning sound straight out of the movies, the brrrap, brrrap of a German burp gun. There was silence, then shouting, then the slower, louder chugging fire of an American BAR, and the irregular crack of several rifles. The burp gun opened up again, or maybe it was another one, and an instant later it was impossible to pick out the separate sounds. The whole street had become a solid uproar of gunfire and spanging, whining ricochets. Prentice brought his rifle up to a trembling port arms and fixed his eyes on the lieutenant. What the hell was he going to do now? Just stand here? He just stood there. And it wasn't long before the noise was over. Then he moved on around the corner and led Prentice and the others into the new street, which was lightly filled with smoke and brick dust. Riflemen were crouched in doorways, were running in both directions and shouting at each other, their faces pink with excitement. Expose a red blotch high on his thigh. And nearer across the street, 3 German soldiers were slowly approaching with their hands locked over their bare heads, followed by a barman who held his weapon pointed at their backs. One of the prisoners, with very long blonde hair that hung against his cheeks, was bleeding from the face. Apparently, for all the noise, it had been only a minor skirmish, a token resistance by the Germans before they surrendered. And the man with the leg wound, $1 million wound, somebody called it, was the platoon's only casualty. Donkey Oboe, Logan was chanting, this is Donkey Dog, Donkey Dog. Riflemen, working in twos, were forcing their way into houses now, smashing doors open with their rifle butts. Apparently, the idea was to search each house on the block for enemy soldiers. But that was as much of the logic of the morning as Prentice could follow. A gate and the other headquarters men were moving back and around to another block now, evidently to check on the progress of another platoon. And as Prentice stayed in their wake, repeatedly stopping to cough, he grew less and less able to make sense of the sights and sounds around him. Things seemed to happen out of sequence, as in a movie that someone had just mindlessly cut and scrambled and spliced together at random. The only continuity was the problem of keeping up, and this soon became a matter of studying a Gates' overshoes as they rose and fell in the snow. Sometimes slowly, sometimes flying into a run, sometimes stopping for long, long waits. Once when they stopped for a while in a little courtyard, Prentice let his head sink against the wall to rest, and he didn't realize he'd gone to sleep on his feet until a distant burst of machine gun fire made his eyes pop open to see a German soldier coming straight at him, less than 5 yards away. It took him a second of dodging back and fumbling with his rifle before he saw that the German was unarmed. He was another prisoner, flushed from one of the houses, and behind him came 4 or 5 more, under the guard of a rifleman who chuckled in passing at Prentice's surprise. He whirled around to look for a gate and found him still there, but over on the other side of the courtyard now, talking with some of his men. An ambulance was there too, with its doors open. It must have driven up while he was sleeping. And litter bearers were bringing a wounded man toward it while a gate and the others watched. Prentice went over to join them as they slid the stretcher gently into the ambulance. The man lay very still under a blanket, wide-eyed and white-lipped, and his face was powdered with brick dust. From the muttered talk around him, Prentice gathered that he was an officer, a battalion artillery observer, and that his wound was very severe. But then the whole scene swam and vanished as he went into another of his coughing fits. When it was over, he found a gate looking at him in a speculative way. "Why don't you get in there too, kid?" he said. "Go ahead if you want to." And one of the medics was tentatively holding open the ambulance doors. "No, sir, that's okay. I'll stay." As soon as his squeaking words were out, he began to regret them. If only Quint had been there, to say it was all right and to go with him, he would have gone. "Okay, it's up to you," the gate said as the ambulance doors slammed shut. "Let's get going." Sometime later, or was it earlier, he followed a Gates cautious back around a corner into some kind of public square and saw him fall flat on his face. Another man fell with him, and it wasn't until Prentice had instinctively fallen too that he realized they were under fire. The ricochets were among them like hornets. In no time at all, he was back safe around the corner, having somehow scrambled up and run with the others. Agate, coming last, was the only one who seemed to know what had happened. There were snipers somewhere high above them, and the only one who had thought fast enough to return their fire. He came crouching and walking backwards, managing to get off 2 or 3 rounds from his carbine. Fucking church steeple trying to again. He saw that there was indeed a church with a brutally amputated steeple. The whole rising structure ended of dancers, so that their upper bodies wouldn't jog the load. From the waist up, they could have been men on bicycles. The man on their stretcher rode as smoothly as if he were in a hospital bed, and Prentice thought with envy of how dreamlike and sweet it must be to be born that way, floating horizontally away to rest, peace, and care. In the middle of the square, the bearers came to a halt and eased the stretcher gently to the ground. They rested for a few seconds, standing wide-legged with their hands on their knees like winded athletes. Then, still moving as one, they squatted to take up their load again. But almost as soon as they raised it, they set it carefully down, and both of them crouched over the wounded man, tenderly lifting his blanket to feel and scrutinize him. And then, with a terrible abruptness, they tore off the blanket, tipped the stretcher high on its side, and sent the man rolling hideously out into the slush. They didn't even look down at him as they turned and ran, heading back to wherever they'd come from, one of them pulling the collapsed stretcher on his shoulder and the other humping along at his side. All their unanimity and grace was gone. They ran with heavy-footed clumsiness of exhausted laborers. By noon the day had turned mild and almost warm. The snow was melting rapidly. There was a continual dripping from the roofs, and there were spores of sweat on Gates' dirty face. Little clusters of civilians had begun to appear on the streets, looking oddly out of place. They would venture bashfully up to the sidewalks and try to speak with the soldiers, apparently trying to explain that all the Germans had left town, until they were shouted and gestured back into their cellars. Sometime in the afternoon, while Gates' overshoes plodded along some other street, a brief barrage of enemy mortar shells sent everyone clambering and tumbling into the cellar of the nearest house. Prentice, almost fainting from the effort of it, heard somebody yell, "Yow!" and thought at first that the man was hit, but it turned out to be a cry of joy. The far wall of the cellar was packed to the ceiling with bottles of wine. And for what seemed a disgracefully long time after that, long after the mortars had stopped, Lieutenant Gate and his men sat guzzling on the floor with all of the furtive pleasure of boys playing hooky from school. Someone had handed Prentice a bottle, and he gulped it as if it were the only medicine in the world that could save him. It made him shudder, but it sent a wonderful strengthening warmth through his chest and back. And he knew that if Agate didn't get him out of here soon, he would drink and drink until he lay insensible on the floor. But just when he'd begun to wish for this very thing to happen, when he'd begun fervently to hope that maybe, somehow, this might mean the whole attack was over and they could stay here celebrating for the rest of the day, Agate was up and leading them out into the sunshine again. And Logan was babbling more of his gibberish about Donkey Dog and Donkey Oboe and Donkey Nan. It must have been soon after that, when he was still enriched by the wine, that Prentice was put to use as a runner for the very first time all day. And he thanked God that his reeling memory had retained, as if by chance, a dim knowledge of where Brewer's second platoon was likely to be. The trip involved a long dog trot, alternating with a fast walk down a street on the perimeter of the town that he guessed was supposed to be the main line of defense against the possibility of a counterattack. It was the place where the company's machine gun positions were set up. And he was walking weakly back along the same street, having delivered his message, before it occurred to him that this must be where Quint was. The first gun emplacement he passed was manned by strangers. But then he saw him, standing alone in a ground floor window with the snout of his gun protruding over the sill. He was wearing a maroon bed quilt wrapped around him like an Indian, and he was smiling. "Hey there, runner," he called in a hoarse voice. Prentice went over close to the window and stopped, looking up at him. "How you feeling?" he said. "I don't know. About the same, I guess. You?" "Little better, maybe. I don't know." "I saw you barrel-assing past out there," Quint said. "I'm glad as hell they let me stay in one place anyway." "Yeah. I hear the artillery spotter was killed." "No, he wasn't killed. I saw him." It gave Prentice a small thrill of pride to be able to give this information. He was pretty badly hit, though. Then after a pause, he said, "Listen, what do you think? You think there's going to be a counterattack or not?" He knew at once it was the kind of question that might exasperate Quint. "How the Christ should I know, Prentice? Will you quit asking questions?" But instead, surprisingly, he got a straight answer. "Hard to say. I doubt it somehow. I know I sure as hell wouldn't try it if I were them." "Me neither. Well, I better get back." "Look, Prentice." Quint reached down behind the windowsill and brought up a clean strip of GI blanket. "I got a hold of an extra blanket and I cut it into thirds to use for mufflers. You fold it this way, you see, and then you put it around and cross it over your chest. That's what I'm doing with mine anyway. Or you could wear it over your head if you'd rather. I know it's not very cold now, but it might get cold again." "Well, thanks. That's very good." Prentice took the scarf and arranged it around his neck. "Thanks a lot," he said. "Then I thought I'd give the third piece to Sam if I can find him." "Good. That's a good idea. Well," he lingered there, looking down at his feet. He felt a great rising temptation to say, "Look, Quint, I'm ready now. If you still want to go back to the aid station, I'll go too." But the unfamiliar wealth of Quint's respect for him was still too new and too valuable to risk losing. All he said was, "Well, I'll see you around. Take care of yourself." "You too," Quint said. And Prentice did his best to put an easy, old combat man swing into his walk as he moved away down the street, very much aware that Quint would stand there watching him until he was out of sight. Once he turned back to make sure of this, and it was true. He waved and Quint waved back, letting the maroon quilt fall away from one shoulder. But that one welling of strength, the one brief time of lucidity, was the first and last of the day for Prentice. For the rest of the oddly warm, wet afternoon, he would hear bursts of machine gun fire and feel no curiosity or interest in where they came from. He would watch Gates' talking face with no idea of what he was saying, as if all words had become as meaningless as Logan's droning donkey talk. At one point, following Agate up an alley and out across an empty lot filled with rubble, he discovered that Agate was drunk. A bottle of Hennessy cognac hung from his hand as he walked, and he was singing to the tune of 1 o'clock jump. "Spread your legs, you're breaking my glasses. Baby, won't you please lay still?" He sang it over and over until the song became the only thing Prentice was truly aware of, the only thread of coherence among turning, shifting images of broken houses and running men and brick dust and smoke and dripping water. Once he saw a vivid close-up of Logan's face, but he had been told to report back to his runner's job at some specific time. But had he been told? Or would someone come and relieve him here? And where the hell was the company headquarters now? Was he supposed to know? He glanced sideways at each of the two men who were staring at him, one of them chewing gum. Was he supposed to know them? He did his best to concentrate on the horizon too, but he had to blink again and again to keep the landscape from swimming in his vision. And he guessed he must have fallen asleep in the schoolroom of his childhood. Agate was at the teacher's desk, sweeping all the books and papers onto the floor to make room for his helmet, his carbine, and his bottle of cognac. Prentice was squeezed into one of the child-sized pupils' desks, on which a number of hearts and initials had been carved. And McGill was slumped in the desk beside him with his big, ungainly bazooka balanced across its top. Logan, in another desk across the table, was saying something about donkey oboe into his radio. "Will the class please come to order?" Agate called out in a mincing, womanish voice. "Will the class please come to order?" The first lesson today will be, let's see now, spelling. He leaned back against the cloudy blackboard, picked a piece of chalk from its shelf, and threw it at McGill's head. "All right for you, Billy McGill," he cried. "You stay after school." And he broke up in a spasm of giggling laughter. Then Prentice saw a couple of men hanging up blankets to black out the windows, and he began to understand that it wasn't a dream. This schoolhouse was to be the company's command post for the night. Yates seemed to tire of his teacher's impersonation. He took a swig of his brandy and began to talk moodily around the classroom, studying his field map, only a little unsteady on his feet as he got down, at last, to business. Sitting on top of Logan's desk, he talked soberly with battalion headquarters on the radio, and then with someone else, and the monotone of his voice put Prentice to sleep for what seemed many hours. "Hey, kid!" His eyes came open to see that Yates, still hunched on Logan's desk, had turned away from the radio to call him across the room. "Wilson's bringing up the bedrolls. You want to ride on back with him? Let him drop you at the aid station?" He tried to speak, but no voice came, so he shook his head to mean no, and Yates went back to the radio. "Okay, Prentice," said Logan, who had turned around in his seat to look contemptuously back at him, exactly like the brightest boy in class, addressing the dunce. "It's your funeral, but if you want to stay, you're going to damn sure have to get on the ball." Then he was asleep again, dreaming that his bandolier straps were caught in some kind of machine that painfully pulled and pushed and pulled and pushed. "Prentice, God damn it, come on!" It was Logan gripping his shoulder and rocking it back and forth. "Okay," he whispered, "I'm awake." He wiped away the saliva that had spilled from his sleeping mouth and tried to understand what Logan was saying. It was something about having to go back for the coastal ranges. Only after he'd struggled up out of the desk and followed Logan around through the door of the schoolroom was he able to grasp that it wasn't coastal ranges but coats and rations. The stuff they had left in the cellar this morning. There were 3 of them on the detail. Logan, Prentice, and another runner whose name was either Con or Khan. They started out 3 abreast, and Prentice was dimly amazed that the others seemed to have no trouble finding their way back through the ruined town. But what amazed him even more was that they were able to walk so fast. He began to fall behind almost at once, stumbling and coughing. The distance between them lengthened to as much as 10 feet, and then it was more like 10 yards. "Come on, Prentice." Walking on rubber legs, hating Logan with all his heart, he watched the 2 of them get smaller and smaller as they moved inexorably ahead in the thin yellow light of late afternoon. They turned a corner, going out of sight, and then they disappeared around another corner just when he'd found them again. He knew that if he didn't find them this time, he'd be lost, unable to get back to the cellar or the schoolhouse. He would go on stumbling alone through these heaps of rubble all night until he fell among the dead. Only once did he find himself in a familiar place, the square where the knocked-off church steeple was, and where the litter-bearers had dumped their corpse. And he caught a glimpse of Logan and the other man vanishing down one of the streets at its opposite end. Gathering all his strength, he took lumbering, running steps across most of the square, then he had to walk again, and it was some seconds before he could see anything clearly through a red fog that went thin and thick in cadence with the beating of his heart. At last, toward the end of one of more impossibly long street, he saw the overturned French half-track. He had his bearings on the cellar now. All that remained was to stay on his feet and keep them lifting and falling, like a man on a treadmill, and he would somehow close the distance. In the gloom of the cellar, he found Logan squatting over a pile of overcoats, counting them. Khan was tying up the corners of a blanket into which he dumped all the K-rations, and there was also another load to carry. 6 bottles of wine and a great many tall mason jars of fruit preserves that they'd looted from the shelves of the place. Prentice looked with longing at the armchair he had used last night. Surely it would be all right to sit down just for a minute. And in creeping through the shadows toward it, he almost fell over 2 bodies. They were lying asleep on mattresses. Owens and the gray-haired man, Luchek. and only now did he realize that he hadn't seen either of them all day. They had both complained about their bowels last night. Could it be that they'd simply stayed behind this morning? Then why the hell hadn't he done the same? Another empty mattress lay not far away, and Prentice sat in his armchair looking down at it. "Owens," Logan was saying. "Owens! God damn it, will you lift your feet?" He was pulling at an overcoat that had become entangled with Owen's legs. "You've been goofing off here all day," Logan told him, wrestling the coat free. "The least you can do is move your goddamn feet." Owen's eyes came open. "Blow it out your ass, Logan," he said. "Don't tell me about goofing off, you shithead." Then, with no change in tone and certainly without trace of humility, he said, "Listen, will you find out what happened to the medics? They were supposed to send up for us hours ago." Prentice expected Logan to answer this with something like, "Maybe they got more important things to do," or "tough shit." But all he said warily was, "Okay, I'll put in another call. Hey, Prentice, take this stuff." And Prentice struggled out of the armchair, slinging his rifle. But he wasn't wholly on his feet before Logan flung a load of 6 or 7 overcoats into his arms, which knocked him back. Very slowly, he managed to force his way up out of the chair again, carrying the coats, and to take 3 steps toward Logan, the rifle sling slipping from his shoulder. "And here," Logan was saying, "take these too, and these." But he was planting mason jars firmly on top of the load of coats, building them up against Prentice's chest like cordwood. Khan was already heading for the door, hauling an immense burden, and Logan was nimbly picking up his own share of the load, a stack of coats slung over one shoulder and a burlap bag bulging with food and wine in the other hand. "Okay," he said, turning away, "let's go." And that was when Prentice gave up. He moved his feet, but instead of going forward, they went back. 3 tottering steps, and he was sprawled in the armchair again with the load on his lap, his helmet coming down hard on the bridge of his nose. One of the mason jars slid off and rolled away across the floor with a dull, gritty sound. "Logan," he tried to call, but no sound came. "Logan." Oh, for Christ's sake, Logan's voice was very far away. "What now?" "I'm sorry. Listen, tell the lieutenant I can't make it. And who the fuck do you think is going to carry all that? I'm sorry. Tell the lieutenant Shit." There was a distant clink and thump as Logan set his own load down. And then Prentice felt the weight on his lap decrease as the jars and overcoats were angrily snatched away. When his trembling arms were free, he reached up and tipped off his helmet, letting it fall to the floor with a terrible crash. Then he slumped forward out of the chair on one knee, his head hanging, and used his rifle stock as a staff to help him walk, on his knees across the swaying floor to the edge of the mattress, where he crawled and squirmed his way into total collapse. Logan was still there, moving around somewhere above him, probably still chewing him out, but he could no longer hear the words. He knew, though, that there was one final thing that he had to say, and that it would have to be said if he took his last breath. "I know," he croaked. "I know you think I'm goofing off, Logan. But get this straight. If I'd wanted to goof off, I'd have done it a week ago." There was no way of telling whether Logan made any reply to this, or even whether he'd heard it, or even whether he was still in the room. Then there was nothing but a silent, spinning darkness. And soon there was a dream in which his mother appeared, saying, "Just rest now, Bobby. Just rest."